This is Scott Richmond
and Arnie Sherman.
You're listening to What Do You Know on Newstalk KGVO, AM 1290 and 1015 FM. Good morning, Arnie.
Scott, how we doing? I haven't seen you in a while. You were gone. You were back east.
I was.
What was going on?
I told you I was back east for a variety of different reasons. One was a family wedding in Long Island, Garden City, which was nice. It was nice to get back home. The second reason I was there is we celebrated my friend's passing and his love of art, music, and Tai Chi. His name is Lou Reed, and the name of the event was The Bells. And it was hosted by Lincoln Center, who's doing a number of outdoor events throughout the summer, Lincoln Center in Manhattan. And this event, The Bells, was literally a marathon, 12-hour day of music, demonstrations, readings by people like Willem Dafoe, Steve Buscemi, Kim Cattrall, musicians like, we had so many musicians there. Lenny Kaye from the Patti Smith Band.
So did you miss being back east? You can tell me.
Oh my God, I did.
You know, because all that action, all that excitement, all of those activities going on has to get you energized.
Arnie, you know what? It's nice to visit home, or our former home,
right?
But it's not home any longer. Missoula and Montana is home. However, the excitement and the things that were going on in the city over the weekend with this Lou Reed celebration. By the way, it was curated by Laurie Anderson, his wife, right, and Hal Wilner, his producer for many years.
Wow.
And this was spectacular. This was special. And it just goes to show you, Lou really, he owned the city in many ways. He was the conscience of the city and the heart of the city. And is as demonstrated or as exhibited by how many people actually attended this event. It was a free event in Lincoln Center, in the whole outdoor area, and also how many different musicians, artists participated.
Sure. Well, when he rose to prominence with the Velvet Underground, and Nico,
right?
They were controversial in real time at their time, and they didn't have a huge following. It just built and over time.
Right.
And then Lou, as you know more than anybody, went on and built his own career, and he was always a staple of the New York rock scene, and was not necessarily recreating himself, but he was on the cutting edge of so much for so long that guys like him and Bruce Springsteen and Billy Joel were like touchstones and anchors for whole segments of the population.
Absolutely. You're so right about that. And he was a real fixture in the downtown scene as well. So he was
almost mythical in some ways, Lou Reed.
People would come to New York looking for him and looking for the places that he described in his song. So below 14th Street was his domain, and especially the lower
you can see him stalking lower, below 14th Street, even though he was originally from Long Island.
He was originally from Long Island, originally from Brooklyn. But what's funny is that how the chickens come home to roost, that he is celebrated above at Lincoln Center in the Tony haughty-taughty kind of nightlife of New York, kind of like where the Metropolitan Opera is.
Sure.
Where the scene of so many famous events.
Right. Exactly. So it reminds me. It makes me feel nostalgic, right? And I left New York, right after high school and went away to college. But I was thinking, and it ties in with our guest today, Chad Dundas, who our listeners are going to meet in a few minutes. Very interesting guest. But I remember as growing up, there were several things that were touchstones as a kid growing up in New York, coming
right.
At the era of television was all upon us. I remember running home to watch Soupy Sales, who had an after-school show, and I'd come home from school. There was a show called The Merry Milkman with Ray Heatherton, and the reason you watched The Merry Milkman, if you were a guy, was his daughter was on the show, who was Joey Heatherton, who later became a bombshell.
Right.
And professional wrestling. There was a need to fill airtime. And so back in that period of time in the 60s, there were a whole group of these wrestlers that had personalities and that you would go and watch. There were guys like Bruno Sammartino. They had great names. They had Buddy Rogers, Johnny Valentine.
Playboy Buddy Rogers.
Right, Playboy Buddy Rogers.
Nature Boy.
Killer Kowalski. Haystacks Calhoun. You remember him?
You name a first name, I'll give you the next name.
Okay.
I was a huge wrestler.
Bobo
Brazil.
Bobo Brazil was one of my favorites.
Another one.
Well, I can't use the first one because it's the, and you won't go.
Okay.
The Sheik. You remember the Sheik? The Sheik.
He was.
So you had all of these guys. Oh, I'll give you another. Argentina.
Apollo.
No, Argentina. Tony.
Rocca.
Yeah, Tony Rocca.
But there was Argentina Apollo,
right,
and there was Argentina Rocca.
There were a whole bunch of them.
What was Argentina Rocca's famous move?
Did he have the drop kick?
He did.
Yeah, he was the drop kick.
Good.
But I just remember going home and watching it, and it was so theatrical at the time.
Yeah.
And I hadn't thought much about wrestling. It really has changed. You got professional wrestling now, and then you have what has really taken off: mixed martial arts, the UFC.
Yeah.
And today, Chad Dundas is going to join us, who is currently the correspondent for mixed martial arts for Bleacher Report. So he's covering it, from Missoula, Montana. And he's recently written a book called Champion of the World, which is about pro wrestling.
Can't wait.
At the cusp of the modern age. It takes place in the 1920s. And I'm going to let him talk all about the book. But for our listeners, here is a grabber, which is the first line of the book. Some books have... you have to really read a lot to get into it and get interested in it.
Right.
This book's 470 pages, so you need something that's going to grab you. And let me just tell you the first line. Tell our listeners the first line. The clowns came to get him when it was time for the hanging. Now, is that a great first line?
It's like it reminds me of like a Dorothy Parker line or something like that.
Right. Or I mentioned to Chad that the only other opening line that I remember as vividly as this is in one of the Ludlum books. Robert Ludlum books. Right. There was a guy who was strapped to a clock tower, and it began by he was pensively waiting for or didn't want the clock to strike the next hour because he was impaled on the clock tower.
Is that
and that was the opening thing. This guy impaled on a clock tower. So today Chad's going to join us. He's going to talk about how he's gone from working at the Missoulian to being a sports writer working for ESPN and NBC and the Sporting News and the Associated Press to the Bleacher Report, and what was his motivation, what was the genesis of this book, which is getting rave reviews. Well, a couple of the reviewers said, you can name the sports book on one hand that are good, and this is one of them.
Well, I can't wait to meet Chad Dundas, and this is going to be a great What Do You Know? And Arnie, we have the distinction of welcoming our sponsor, our premier sponsor.
This is very exciting. After all this time, somebody listened and heeded our call and has joined in as a lead sponsor for us.
Exactly. So new sponsor to the show, Don Maddox and Glacier Sotheby's International Realty, which is a high-end realty group here in lovely Missoula.
Well, you know how high-end it is. She's handling that property at Flathead Lake that's $39 million sale.
Among her many, that's right. And it's an incredible property, and we'll talk a little bit about that later in the show. But also, Dawn and Glacier Sotheby's can be found at www.glaciersir.com. That's her website. And, I'm thrilled to welcome them, and I think they're going to be a great addition to the show. And we will be back with What Do You Know right after this. We're back with What Do You Know, brought to you by our new partners, Don Maddox and Glacier Sotheby's International Realty. And who's our guest, Arnie? We have a good guest
We
here
have
today.
a great guest, Chad Dundas. There's a lot of things we want to talk to you about. I'm too excited to even do an intro on you because you got all of these things going on with MMA and UFC, and you're a columnist for Bleacher Report, and that's like in real time. But at the same time, you wrote this novel, Champion of the World, which I'll read right off the cover, a brilliant novel about life and sport at the cusp of the modern age. And I've read it, and it is an amazing novel. And to me, in my group of friends, I like to be the one who discovers the first, album of a new artist or the first book. And among my peers and friends, I was the first one to find Michael Chabon's The Amazing, Cavalier and Clay, which was, a Pulitzer Prize-winning book. And I'd say I'm going to be excited to share Champion of the World with everyone because I think in the sports genre, this book is of that same quality.
Well, gosh, thanks so much for saying that. I appreciate it. That's kind. And maybe if you start referring it to your friends, you and I can get involved in some kind of a kickback situation. We'll put a contract together.
It'll be up online.
Well, you have
we'll
an
be
advance to pay off, don't you?
Yes, yeah.
We told you we weren't going to talk about money, but you
okay. I'll leave a $5 bill on the chair when I go.
Well, Putnam is an excellent publisher, and that's probably a story in and of itself. How you tell us that story.
Yeah, tell us
how did a guy from Missoula who used to work for the Missoulian and got a master in fine arts at the University of Montana and did some fiction? How'd you get a contract? I mean, that's like the gold ring.
Sure, an agent.
Putnam to write to do a book for you.
Yeah, I can tell you when you sit down to write a novel about professional wrestling in the 1920s, the last thing you think is this is going to be huge and everyone's going to love it, right? Right. You just want to trick somebody into reading it at some point. And I kind of was lucky in that I published a short story in a small noir fiction literary journal out of New York called Thuglit in mid 2014, and I didn't really think anything of it other than the fact that it was a great journal to work with. They were very professional. But after the story came out, I just kind of put it out of my mind. But a couple weeks later, I got an email from the publisher of the literary journal, and he says, this agent, who was a guy that I'd heard of before, read your story and really likes it, wants to know if you have a novel in the works. Why don't you shoot him an email? Just so happened I did have a novel in the works, although it was not anything close to its finished form, but I emailed my current agent, Nat Sobel, and sent him the draft of the novel, and he liked it. And then he and I worked on it together probably for about 3 years. I was extremely lucky to land with his agency. He took a very hands-on approach and showed a lot of care for the novel that he didn't have to and that I didn't necessarily expect. And then we also, once we thought it was in good enough shape to start sending it out to publishers, we were also super lucky to land with Sarah Minich at Putnam, who turned out to be just a brilliant and patient editor who also showed so much care for the book. Those, right? And me especially. I need both. I need to have around me both brilliance and patience. I need both those things. So
I think most people don't realize what an important role an editor plays in a book.
Yeah,
and this probably doesn't look anything. Well, it has the germs of what what you began with, but there's probably a lot of deconstructing and reconstructing that an editor, particularly a seasoned editor, adds to the process.
Yeah, and my agent was so smart and was frankly right about everything, and came up with so many just brilliant ideas that were the kind of things that when you hear them out loud, you're like, why didn't I think of that? I've been working on this thing for several years. Like, this idea that he has is so simple and elegant and makes me feel like a dummy for not thinking of it. But
that's why you work with them, though. They help you expand.
So this story, 400 takes 470 so pages to tell this story, and it's a mixture of the age of wrestling in the at the turn of the century in the 20s, actually in the 1920s, and it also mixes Prohibition and gambling and Montana theme into it, and even a little bit racial theme into all of that. When did you get the original idea for this?
Well, unbeknownst to me, I think I'd been getting ready to write the book for a long time, just because I was fortunate to grow up during what are considered the two quote-unquote golden ages of professional wrestling in America, first during the mid-1980s, and then later during the mid to late 1990s. And I was, as a young guy, kind of infatuated with the spectacle of wrestling and the over-the-top nature of all the characters and stuff like that. And as I got a little older, and some of that kind of scripted drama started to wear on me a little bit as an older guy, I got more interested in the history of wrestling. And I get kind of obsessive about stuff that I'm interested in. So I kind of set about, just for my own curiosity, trying to figure out all that I could about the history of wrestling, because it's so unique and strange and still so murky, even though a lot has been written about it at this point.
Well, I mean, Abraham Lincoln and George Washington were wrestlers.
Sure. In fact, some historians say that Abraham Lincoln first kind of launched himself to national prominence as a politician by winning this wrestling match that he engaged in as a very young man. I don't have
the figure 4 leg lock as his finishing move.
Yeah, not too different than what we experience today, honestly. But yeah, that's what they say, that the germ of his national prominence was in part because he won this high profile wrestling match as a young man.
So based on your research, when did professional wrestling change from being athletics to being a scripted performance?
The $1 million question.
$1 million question, but based on your research,
Sure.
what do you
When
think?
did it really change?
Yeah.
Really.
Well, when I first started researching the book, I really wanted to pinpoint that moment. I thought that there might be a really prominent line of demarcation between sport and spectacle. But as I started to do the research, I learned there's just no real way to tell the exact moment. And part of that is because the history of wrestling has always been kept by con men. Even when it was a legitimate sport, there was a lot of showmanship and a lot of mythologizing going on.
Carnivals and stuff.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
Even then it was
so the narrowest that I can put it is that sometime in the late 19-teens to early 1920s, when a lot of really interesting stuff was happening with sporting culture in America, some either diabolical or forward-thinking promoters, depending on how you look at it, got together and decided, since box office gates were in the toilet and wrestling's popularity was really declining at the time, they thought we can make more money by faking it than we can with the real thing. And the devil of it was that they turned out to be absolutely right.
Yeah, that's correct. You know, and at the same time, there's a parallel track of amateur wrestling.
Sure, yeah.
You know, which, came to, I guess, the public's attention just recently with Foxcatcher, right? Which saw how patrons kind of, because there's no money in amateur wrestling. And so you have that going on, but the professional world is a completely different world. So do you see is it a permutation or is it, an embellishment, mixed martial arts? Is that more wrestling than boxing? Is the UFC? How does that all fit together?
A lot of MMA fans will try to deny this to you, but MMA and professional wrestling actually share a common ancestor. And it's the kind of stuff that I write about in this book in what they call catch wrestling, catch-can wrestling, submission grappling.
Right.
The kind of professional wrestling when it was a legitimate sport that was popular at the turn of the century. So the kind of action that you see in mixed martial arts today, at least in the grappling part of the sport, is probably closer to the action that you would read about in this book than, say, amateur wrestling.
Right, because in boxing today, you can name a couple of the major boxers.
Sure.
But you talk about MMA, and people can, go down the list of, Brock Lesnar and Randy Couture and Ronda Rousey. And
sure.
I mean, everybody knows those names because they've transcended just the sport. You can see the Entourage movie and, Ronda's in it.
Yeah.
Boxers really haven't made that kind of move.
Yeah. MMA has benefited from a number of different solidifying, stabilizing forces over the history of the sport in America. And I think it's shrewd that you bring up a connection between MMA and professional wrestling, because while MMA is a legitimate sport, obviously they're out there engaging in actual competition. There's such an important entertainment aspect to it because the financial model of mixed martial arts is not the same as, say, football or basketball.
So let's go back to the one thing, which is the connection to professional wrestling at the turn of the century. So meaning professional wrestling at that time was a submission-based thing where actually they were legitimately fighting with one another, and if someone pretty much choked someone else out or whatever it was with professional wrestling, that's where the connection is, correct?
Sure, yeah.
But then the financial model of MMA, is it more like boxing than it is? Wrestling is, they all work for the employer. They're all, right? They all are beholden to Vince McMahon, right?
Yeah.
But in boxing, help me understand this, but in boxing, they're independent agents and they're beholden to their promoter.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
So there are many promoters.
Yes.
So MMA, though, isn't it the brothers that own UFC, which is the WWF of MMA?
Yes.
But
our listeners are going to get completely confused.
Right.
By all this.
I mean, I think if we do need a bar graph or a pie chart to talk about this, but it's a legitimate. They are able to make more money based on their stature.
Yes,
and their legitimate money.
You unknowingly just opened up an enormous kettle of worms here.
Did I?
Yeah, you did. MMA has been fortunate from a business model standpoint that there's really one dominant purveyor of the sport in America, the UFC.
Right.
And the UFC, up until 3 or 4 weeks ago, was owned by Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta, who are the scions of a Las Vegas casino empire.
Right.
And their business partner, Dana White, who's the guy everybody knows, who's the president of the UFC, the face of the company. Right. And because while they don't have a legal monopoly on the sport, they have a functional monopoly on the sport.
Okay.
They have been able to structure the business in kind of a unique way in sports, because the UFC, it's not a sports league. It's not a franchise like a team. It's certainly not the NCAA. It's not a nonprofit entity like the NFL is, quote unquote. I'm doing air quotes right now in the studio.
It's like wrestling. It's like the WWE.
It's a privately held company,
right?
So they are
public.
In pro wrestling, when they say we're going to have to take this to the commissioner,
yes,
the commissioner is going to. There was no commissioner.
No, but there is. So wait a second though. But with UFC, there really is a commissioner. There really is there's a real matchmaker who is making matches based on someone's ascendancy in the ranks versus whether they're a good talker or not, which is wrestling.
Well, based on whatever they want, because they're a privately held company. Now they do have to, be sanctioned by state athletic commissions. They, at this point, the UFC does close to 50 fight cards a year, all over the country, all over the world.
And what role does William Morris Endeavor play?
They just bought the UFC.
That's right.
They bought it outright?
They did, yeah.
Wow.
A group of investors led by William Morris Endeavor, WMG, IMG, and a couple other companies, some venture capital firms from China, and a couple other business partners.
They've really got into running, a business like this.
It's going to be interesting to see how the new ownership affects the way the company operates. In a lot of ways, not only because, as you said, William Morris is a talent agency, and so they are experts in getting as much money as they possibly can for actors and athletes, the people that they represent.
Right.
Now they're going to be on exactly the other side
to keep
of the negotiation.
And that brings up an important point that I'm curious about. I looked at some of the earnings, of people like Anderson Silva and George St. Pierre.
You guys are going straight to the heart of this. When I said you opened up a can of worms, I had no idea.
Okay, I'm drilling right down into those worms. They don't seem to make as much money as their counterparts in boxing, right? I mean, some of the big matches, the heavyweight, middleweight bouts are, in the multi-millions of dollars. It seems that the contracts for them, and obviously when you move to the women, the Holly Holm or Ronda Rousey, they're in the hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yes.
So is the audience different?
Isn't their fight cycle
split different? Why is
You remember a few minutes ago I said that the sport has benefited from having a strong centralized force in the UFC.
Right.
Whether or not the athletes have benefited for that is a whole different question, and people will tell you a lot of different things. But to, as specifically as I can, answer your question, because the UFC is a privately held company, all of its financial information is also private.
Right.
So all of the payouts that you mention are the official payouts that have to be reported to the public by the State Athletic Commission.
Right.
Now, the UFC has long trafficked in other, in increasing athlete payouts behind the scenes. But you're right to say that these famous MMA fighters are making a lot less than the famous boxing counterparts.
Hollywood studio days where they had contract actors and they were on the payroll of the studio.
No, and like in boxing, guys like Floyd Mayweather have the power because they're the stars. They control the promotion of their fights.
50 million a fight.
In MMA, traditionally the UFC has had the power because it's the strong, centralized, privately held company that runs the sport. Now, we don't know exactly what the revenue split is because all the financial information is private, but the closest estimation that I read recently is that it's probably about 85%, 15%.
To the fighters.
To the fighters.
But the cycle of fighting is a lot. It's not like boxing where somebody may fight once a year or once every 2 years. UFC guys are fighting every 18 weeks or something.
It depends. It depends on how high profile you are. It depends on how much money you make. A champion, like in a perfect world, probably fights twice a year.
Twice? Okay.
Yeah.
How many big UFC events are there a year? Like the UFC, what are we going on, 202?
Yeah, well, like I said, they do close to 50 events per year now. About 12 of those will be on pay-per-view every year, and those are considered the real tentpole events.
Those are the ones that get the numbers, right?
Yeah, those are the ones that they want people to shell out $60 to pay for. Those are the ones that, in theory, have the biggest stars, et cetera, et cetera.
So you're the lead writer at Bleacher Report for mixed martial arts.
Let's do a quick ID first. Okay, our guest is Chad Dundas. He wrote a book called Champion of the World, and he's our guest on What Do You Know?
So you're the lead reporter on Bleacher Report. And you write a column how often?
A couple of times a week, usually.
So And you're living in Missoula, Montana.
Yeah.
So is most of this by watching it on media? Or how many of these events you actually go to face?
Yeah, almost none anymore. I used to work for ESPN, and they used to send me around to a lot of them. But at this point,
Bleacher Report, Turner?
Yeah. Okay. The Bleacher Report is owned by Turner. They're based out of San Francisco. And Bleacher Report is one of the few big, broad-based mass market sports websites that has figured out how to be really, really profitable.
Yeah.
Which is great for me. But it also means that they don't do a huge travel budget for writers, especially not for a niche sport like MMA, and especially not in the day and age like today when almost everything that the UFC does, from press conferences to open workouts to the actual event to the post-fight show, is all available online. You can do a lot of, quote-unquote reporting just from your house. So they don't send me around very much. But I used to go a lot when I worked for ESPN, which was great for a time. But now, I'm married, I have 2 small kids. I'm kind of happy to stick around the house more than...
So who do you like to cover? Whose lives are interesting to you in the industry when you're writing your columns?
I'm lucky to cover MMA because, like I said, it's kind of a niche sport. There's a very important entertainment aspect of it. So, you don't find a lot of the kind of cliches that have infested other sports. These people are out there very much trying to promote themselves and very much trying to be flamboyant and bombastic. And so it can be interesting, and sometimes, it can border on crazy to interview a lot of these people. I think the guy that everyone will know who is a huge star right now and a big-time firebrand and a great talker is Conor McGregor, the Irish current featherweight champion. And he has been a revelation. So fun to cover and such a good talker, so articulate. And maybe the guy with the most innate business sense, the best understanding of the business side of fighting.
So it's interesting, when a fighter can take a page out of the book of the the blueprint is there, right?
Right.
Muhammad Ali, Gorgeous George, Buddy Rogers, you could look to certain Hulk Hogan. You could look to
The Rock. Look how he's transcended everything.
But these are so with the MMA, for someone to take a page out of the book of a professional wrestler in boxing, like a Conor McGregor, he will, and he puts the body. He has the fight behind it, so he's not just a talker.
Sure.
That's the perfect package.
It is. And you know what? It's a lot more difficult than people think. I think there's this idea, especially in our business, that everyone should do what Conor McGregor does. Everyone should be this outsized character. And it's you have to be so quick on your feet. You have to be so witty. You have to have such a gift of gab that most professional athletes can't really do it. Right. I don't know a lot of people that could do it. And so, it's on paper, it sounds good to say everyone should be like a WWE superstar. Everyone should be like Stone Cold Steve Austin or The Rock. Right. In practice, people try to do it, and if you're not good at it,
Hulk
it's
Hogan
embarrassing.
Tried, right? And he was one of the biggest star probably of his time, and he just didn't have what Conor has, or The Rock, or
We have Chad here, though. Let's ask him. Okay, so who are the top 3 talkers in your opinion from wrestling?
Oh, wow.
Over the years.
All time?
Of all time.
Well, you got to put Ric Flair in there. Flair. And Flair was one of these guys who was notorious for never planning anything. There's stories that he would actually drive his opponents crazy because they would be going out for a high-profile match at Madison Square Garden or the Astrodome or something. Right. He'd be like, we'll figure it out when we get out there.
Kept it spontaneous.
Don't worry. We'll figure it out. And so Flair was wonderful. The Rock, I think, was in his day really, really, really good. Like I said, Steve Austin was another guy who made almost all of his money on the mic because by the time he really ascended to the top levels of professional wrestling, he was kind of limited physically. It was kind of toward the end of his career. Geez, that's a really broad question.
On the women's side, is Ronda. Gina Carano.
Fabulous Moolah?
Yeah.
Gina Carano obviously transcended.
That's my era, Fabulous Moolah.
Yeah. Ronda Rousey is a good interview and is very, very frank, and will tell you if she thinks that you asked her a bad question, and will let you know exactly how she feels.
It's interesting. So, in a weird way, her losing to Holly Holm actually was probably the best thing that could ever have happened to her, because I realized she became human at that point. Because you remember what she used to say before? She said, if I ever get beat, I'm going to kill myself. She used to say stuff like that.
Well, I know. She thought 20 seconds was all anybody was going to last.
It upset the sport. I think it totally upset the sport. Because Holly went and lost the next match.
Yeah.
And then she lost again.
Yeah.
To the Russian gal a couple nights ago.
It's been very hectic and chaotic at that women's bantamweight division.
To come back though, isn't it?
It is, and she's been kind of MIA since she lost. We're not exactly sure what her future holds. She's going to make this Roadhouse remake as a film star. And we're going to have to see what she thinks her future holds in MMA.
Is she going to play the Swayze role?
She is, yeah, she is.
So they're going to do a female version.
Are you worried, Chad? Wait a minute, I'm hearing what Chad's saying. He's worried that potentially she goes by way of Mike Tyson, or like she never fully realizes the potential that she could have been because she may get distracted. To me.
Yeah, Ronda's one of these people who, a lot like Brock Lesnar, has always trained in one place and has one coach. And, if you're going to be critical of her style, that's probably the thing you can be critical of. A lot of the other top athletes in the sport kind of live this almost samurai lifestyle where they go around all the top trainers in America and they sharpen their skills. They may become better rounded.
Well, it's like golfers who switch.
But she's getting distracted, it sounds like.
Well, for mentally, it had to be a big time challenge for her.
She got hurt bad.
She had been destroying everybody, Mike Tyson style, just running through everybody, but had always been pretty one-dimensional. It was her Olympic level judo skills that she was using for the most part. And then she meets up with Holly Holm, who's big, very mobile,
the Buster Douglas of the MMA,
a very talented striker, and Ronda couldn't take her down, and she got kicked in the head and knocked out. So she went from being indestructible to being completely destructed in one night. And Ronda's such an interesting personality just in how she was raised and all that. I think that threw her for a loop, and she's been out for a while.
Do you think she may not come back?
I think she will come back. I don't know if she'll come back in a full-time capacity. We've all, ever since she ascended to being she was the top star in MMA for a long time and might still be. Right. We've kind of known that she's probably not going to be around forever. Hollywood,
but this
wants her.
They weren't expecting it to be this soon, though. In this, she was supposed to be Holly Holm.
I really do think her psyche was damaged. I mean,
completely.
Even in the movie Entourage, she played the caricature of herself. She said, "If you could stay," she told Turtle, of the Entourage group, "You could stay in the ring with me for 30 seconds. I'll go out with you." She, that sort of personified her bravado about herself until she got in the ring with Holly and got her butt kicked.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see when she comes back, how she comes back, who she fights. It'll be one of the top stories of this year and next year, depending on
Cyborg
when she returns.
She's got a good name.
Yeah, Chris Cyborg Justino. They went back and forth in the press for years, Ronda and Cyborg.
Fought, though, right?
Yeah, they're not in the same weight class. Like Ronda would have
to. What's her name would have to go up, right? Wait,
Cyborg fights at 145. Ronda used to fight at 145 and now fights at 135. Has fought at 135 in the UFC the entire time. The UFC basically made a women's bantamweight division just for Ronda Rousey. Dana White had always said previous to her arrival that women will never fight in the UFC. But then, the UFC ownership kind of got taken with her charisma. I think they realized that they had a star on their hands. So they created this women's bantamweight division for her to run through it. And Cyborg fights in women's featherweight division, which is 10 pounds heavier, and has always said she can't safely make the weight at 135. Right. So that's always been a sticking point.
Chad, you know what's amazing about this conveation? How women have taken on such a prominent role in this sport.
Absolutely.
I mean, in boxing, after Ali fought, there's not that many women in boxing. There certainly weren't many women, even in WWF. There were women around it, but they weren't women like this. That were fighting. And we spent
Eddie Grable.
Eddie Grable.
Wait, what were some? Let's talk about some of the female wrestlers. Fabulous Moolah. Yeah. Okay, Cowboy Wendy Richter. Cowgirl.
Wendy Richter is probably one of the bigger names.
That was in the 80s.
Yeah.
Right.
Actually, women's pro wrestling at the WWE level is undergoing a renaissance right now because of how they've kind of restructured the company, and they have this developmental territory called NXT where they get a lot of their big talent now, and they have a very vibrant women's division.
Well, probably
and they're
because MMA showed them the way.
I think they saw Ronda become a big star, and they thought we're missing out on something here.
Ronda.
So they have Sasha Banks and Charlotte Flair, who's Ric Flair's daughter, and she was the champion.
You're going to go back into this recently. Again.
I'm going to hang with Chad,
and they're very talented. They can wrestle just as well as the men at this point.
Did you grow up watching wrestling on Saturday mornings, Saturday evenings, like every week religiously?
For the most part, yeah.
I grew up watching on Saturday nights in New York City The WWE was on at midnight.
Yeah.
But before that, it was the IWA. There was a division called the IWA, which was the Mighty Igor and Mil Mascaras, and my favorite, Ox Baker.
Baker.
The Heart Punch.
Yeah.
Like, I would be curious, if you name a wrestler, I'm going to name a wrestler, I want to see if he knows the move that he used.
Oh, wow, geez.
Bobo Brazil.
Probably not. I know who Bobo Brazil is, but I don't know the finishing move. A little bit before my time.
We talked drop kick.
No, Coco Butt.
The Coco, yeah, that's right. He was
Coco Butt.
The Coco Butt.
There was a headbutt.
Yeah.
But it was...
He's reliving his childhood right on the show here.
It's fun to watch.
Let me switch gears for a minute.
Sure.
Dusty Rhodes.
Dusty, you can't
Bionic Elbow.
Bionic Elbow.
Yeah.
See, that's what...
Dusty Rhodes. Everybody knows that.
Everybody knows that. So,
another great talker. I should have mentioned him earlier.
Yes, he was a great talker. May he rest in peace.
Very colorful characters in the book.
Yeah.
And you came up with great names.
Thank you.
The main protagonist is Pepper Van Deen.
I love that name.
There's also
Pepper Gomez.
There's Garfield Taft,
great,
who was the
president,
who's fighting at one point in the book is fighting to be heavyweight wrestling champion of the world. And the book kind of alludes to the fact that back in that era, the championship of the world in boxing was almost the same as in wrestling. You had Jack Johnson in real life, and
right.
So how did you come up with these names? Was it a labor of love or how? These are great names. And there are other great names in the book.
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, I had tried to have a lot of fun with the wrestling world in this book. Even though I'm writing about legitimate wrestling, I wanted to make it accessible and interesting to a modern audience. So I tried to weave in a lot of thematic stuff, both from modern day professional wrestling and from mixed martial arts, which I have an intimate knowledge of. And obviously the names is part of that. We were just talking about Bobo Brazil, probably not the man's real name. And so you have a long
Harbor, Michigan.
You have a long history of wrestlers working under these pseudonyms, even when it was real. The dominant heavyweight champion of the early 1900s, Frank Gotch, at one point went on a barnstorming tour where he wrestled across Alaska, which is unthinkable by modern standards.
Right.
And he did so under an assumed name, obviously, because
Pepper Van Deen was an assumed name.
Yeah, it turns out in the book Pepper Van Deen's not Pepper Van Deen's real name. But when Frank Gotch wrestled across Alaska, he did it under an assumed name because he didn't want to show up as the heavyweight champion of the world. He wanted to show up as this guy who just thought he was tough. So all the tough Alaskan, fisher boat guys would want to wrestle him.
So we all know now from listening for the last 30 minutes or so about your passion for wrestling. But in this book, you mixed in circus and bootlegging and gambling. Were those new research topics for you? And
yeah. For some of them, they were. In fact, probably the thing that I knew the least about was the history of bootlegging in Montana, which is a plot line in this book. But fortunately, there are a lot of small presses in Montana that churn out pretty good historical books almost constantly.
The only one that I knew of that you was Shorty Young, who was based out of, Havre?
Yes. I read a wonderful book about the history of Prohibition on the High Line.
I mean, those guys were selling, bootleggers in Montana.
This is incredible.
Were selling booze that they made here and got from Canada across the border in almost in every state except one, as I recall.
Yeah, they would get guys who had been World War I pilots to fly it across the border, or they would bring it across the border.
Is that right?
They would do all kinds of crazy stuff. They would make big hay bales, but the inside was hollowed out so they could park cars in there so you wouldn't see them from the road, but they would have all of their trucks.
Well, back in the 20s, there were only 2 border crossings, right?
Yeah.
And the governor had, about a dozen people to cover almost 600 miles. So
amazingly,
fertile territory.
Where was Donald Trump when you needed him?
We don't need him. We don't need him.
We don't really need him.
The history of bootlegging and prohibition in Montana is kind of fascinating because Montana was kind of against it. It was sort of a states' rights. Very, a lot of really urban voting blocks actually at the time in Montana because you had Butte, which was a huge town, and the people there weren't rural. They wanted to be able to drink liquor. And so during Prohibition, the people of Montana were a lot more loyal to local bootleggers like Shorty Young and Havre than they were to the federal government. Like they would actively help hide the liquor and hide the
guys. Why would you be with the federal government when you're going to?
I love Montana more now because
Shorty was employing a lot of people here. World War I veterans.
Our guest is Chad Dundas, and his book, his new novel on Putnam, is Champion of the World, and we're gonna have to read. I'm gonna have to read this after this interview.
So I'm not going to give anything away because our listeners need to read the book because it's fantastic. But Is there a second book in mind with these same characters, or are you going to move on to something else?
No, I have a second book that I'm working on now for Putnam. It's not related to the first one. It's a contemporary mystery about a guy who comes back from the war in Iraq and thinks that he has suffered a traumatic brain injury from an IED explosion during his last days in the war. So his biographical memory has been fractured. He doesn't remember very much about his childhood. He comes back to Montana, and in the process of kind of like trying to investigate his own past, he gets mixed up in a present day mystery that he also has to solve at the same time.
That's kind of an interesting approach. Where did that idea come from?
The developing science of brain health is something that I deal with a lot in my job as a sports writer, and had also read a lot about veterans coming back with traumatic brain injuries. And like all that stuff is kind of interesting to me because we're just now figuring out like how the brain works, and because of the medical advancements. Yeah, because of the medical advancements and a lot of the medical advancements that they're making in the theater of war. A lot of guys that might have died in Vietnam or World War II are coming home alive now.
Is that right?
Well, there's more wounded than dead, in proportion compared to previous wars.
All right, we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back with our final segment with Chad Dundas. You're listening to What Do You Know on KGVO AM and FM, presented by Dawn Maddox, Glacier Sotheby's International Realty. Back after this. Okay, we're back with the final segment with Chad Dundas on What Do You Know?
So you were mentioning brain damage and all that. It leads me to a question about performance enhancers in the MMA.
Sure.
Is there a lot of that? Are they promoting? Are different participants, different athletes performing different, supporting different supplements or sponsoring different things?
I mean, we think that there are probably a lot of performance enhancers in MMA. Last year, the UFC just partnered with the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency to create a new, advanced, much more aggressive drug testing program than they've ever had before. Previous to last year, they would always kind of wash their hands of it and say that was a state athletic commission issue.
Right.
But, it started to become a problem. They had some high-profile guys test positive for PEDs, and so they decided to create this new kind of company-wide drug testing policy that, in theory, is cleaning up the sport. And so, the testing is a lot more aggressive now.
Is it more aggressive than boxing?
Yeah, probably, because, again, you have a centralized, privately held company that has all these independent contractors that work for it, and they can, they can impose their will a little bit more. Like, boxers are basically probably only doing either.
What's the common injury with UFC or MMA? What is like the injury? Because I know, like, especially, is it torn muscles?
Yeah, injuries are really common. Training injuries are unfortunately really common. It's why you see late changes in UFC cards a lot more than you do in boxing. And I think it's because of the mixed striking and grappling components. Mm-hmm. And the sport is so new. Like, I don't know that people have figured out 100% how to train for it correctly yet. And so there are a lot of various injuries. You see a lot of torn knee ligaments. You see a lot of, blown out shoulders, a lot of like neck and back injuries. Because you see a lot of every kind of injury, frankly.
And in wrestling, interestingly enough, that we saw the spate of you see the deaths. I mean, wrestlers die early. They die young. And it's not it's not like it's some type of coincidence. But there are guys that have been dropping dead from the age of 31 to 54. And why was that? Why is that?
Well, I mean, nobody knows exactly for sure. Those wrestling stars of the 70s and 80s were living a pretty hard lifestyle.
Right.
I think that many of them will cop to that themselves. Lots of drinking, lots of drug use.
Remember Mickey Rourke in The Wrestler?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a good example.
And then a lot of performance enhancing drugs. And back in those days, the people were doing really hardcore bodybuilding drugs that would probably kind of mess you up physically. A lot of those wrestlers who die of heart attacks die of what they call enlarged hearts, which is, potentially a sign of PEDs use. And the science of PEDs has come a long way since then. There's a lot more money in making performance enhancers than there is in catching guys for doing performance enhancers. So at this point, we don't know what the stuff guys are doing now, how it will affect them later.
One question. So you brought up The Wrestler, a great movie, right? Based on I don't know if it's even based on a book or a screenplay. But do you have aspirations, Chad, for this to become actually a movie or a screenplay?
Oh, I would love it. The movie and film rights are available. If anyone out there listening
it's a great story for a film.
Yeah,
or a series on TV. Because the way Arnie was describing it felt like there was a bit of like a Boardwalk Empire, like a Prohibition type.
I'm keeping
gangsters and gamblers and circus
and wrestling.
It's a
great throw wrestling in there.
Confluence of all those things.
I'm keeping my fingers crossed. We'll see what happens.
Well, we have a great audience here, by the way.
So when as a kid growing up, there was a Mexican wrestling league.
Yeah.
Right?
Sure. There still are lots.
Right. Is MMA a global phenomenon, or is it really U.S. driven?
Well, in the last few years, the UFC has done a big international push to try to expand their reach. They've gone to, Eastern Europe a lot. It's pretty big in Brazil. It used to be, it still is big in Canada. Not as big maybe as it was a few years ago. They've really tried to reach out to the Latino markets in Mexico. They've tried to push into Japan and China. And I think these new owners that we talked about earlier in the show, one of their primary goals, I think, will be to push into the Chinese market and to try to establish a foothold there.
Well, I used to work for Madison Square Garden, and I used to work for the NBA. So talk about China, the NBA. That's right. However, UFC is not sanctioned in New York State.
It is now. It just got sanctioned about 6 to 8 weeks ago.
So will it be at the Garden?
Yeah, they're going to the Garden this year.
This is fantastic.
Yeah, the most recent New York Assembly session,
that's great.
They sanctioned it after a long lobbying effort.
Shelley Silver, who was opposing it? They had to get Sheldon Silver out of there. He's going to jail now.
Right. So
yeah. That's another completely long story kettle of fish. That a long-standing beef between the Fertitta brothers, who used to own the UFC, and the Culinary Union in Las Vegas had a lot to do with keeping MMA out of New York.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, because Station Casinos, the fleet of casinos that are owned by the Fertitta brothers, is one of the largest non-union casinos in Vegas. And so they have a long-standing dogfight going on with the Culinary Union.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And so how did it impact New York? So they basically
would just lobby. They have the Las Vegas Culinary Union is powerful, and so they would reach out to, I think, different unions in New York. They would spend a lot of lobbying money. It was a real political dogfight, man. It was a lot of stuff going on.
That's amazing.
So for our listeners who have now had their interest piqued in MMA, maybe if they haven't been fans before, who are some of the younger, up-and-coming fighters that people should be keeping an eye out for?
Well, yeah, they've had a lot of turnover at the top this year, especially. I mentioned Conor McGregor earlier. He's fighting at UFC 202 on August 20th. He does a rematch with Nate Diaz, who he lost to. He's definitely a guy to keep an eye on. The future of the light heavyweight division is up in the air. Probably the best fighter in the world, Jon Jones, has been the longtime champion there, but he's a guy who can't keep himself out of trouble outside the cage. He just got suspended again for violating a drug test, or flunking a drug test. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens with that division. A longtime veteran in the UFC, Michael Bisping, who's an English guy who had been pretty important to their international expansion efforts, just won the middleweight title in a huge upset over Luke Rockhold, who was a young guy who I would have told you keep your eye on Luke Rockhold until he got beat by Michael Bisping. And so he's going to fight another longtime veteran, Dan Henderson, for the middleweight title here coming up. It's just very chaotic right now in the sport.
And that's good in a way. It is. New faces and new matches.
Did you ever study martial arts yourself or fighting?
Not very much, just a little bit when I was a kid in Taekwondo. And I have a friend who's pretty into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and he's beat me up a few times before.
But it's interesting because I always thought of why. So you're a huge fan of MMA and of wrestling. Why was it the theatrics of it?
Yeah, I think so. Like, I've always been kind of drawn to professional and amateur wrestling, just because I think amateur wrestling is so hard. It's such a physically grueling sport. It's always been kind of fascinating to me. And as a kid, professional wrestling was fascinating to me. I think just for the spectacle of it all, and MMA probably too. When I first got into it, like there was just something kind of irresistible about it. It was almost like a movie, like Jean-Claude Van Damme in Bloodsport. They would bring all these guys of different disciplines together, and they would have this crazy, weird tournament together.
I think what's very interesting, though, is the MMA audience is different than the wrestling audience in the sense of household income, earning potential, the professional versus wrestling, which I guess wrestling is all over the board.
I think they also eschew boxing. I mean, I don't. They don't.
Boxing's a different audience too. Yeah. It's like, but MMA is a high end audience. I mean, that's a coveted
They're right there in the 18 to 34-year-old male
with disposable income, and they're independent. They have money to spend. Whereas wrestling fans, it's little kids. I'm not saying it's us too, but I'm saying it's mostly appeals to a different audience.
But then you get the $1 million guy like Brock Lesnar who comes along and he ties up all of those demographics together, and he becomes the most important guy in the sport while it lasts.
Who was your favorite wrestler growing up?
I was a big time Junkyard Dog guy early on, and then
rest in peace.
As soon Sylvester Ritter, R.I.P. Right. And then as soon as the Undertaker debuted at the 1991 Survivor Series, I was a big time Undertaker convert. Mark Calloway for years.
The Undertaker.
I saw him at the airport once when I was going to cover a UFC event. He was going to the UFC
really?
too. He and Shane McMahon were actually at the airport together, and I saw them both, and it was like a heart palpitation moment for me. Even though I was like, I was a 33-year-old man at that point, but I was still just like, oh, it's the Undertaker. I couldn't go talk to him. I was too scared.
That.
So, Champion of the World is your novel. Are you doing book signings?
I did a bunch. I did 2 in Missoula and 1 in Great Falls and 1 in Bozeman and Portland, Oregon and Ann Arbor, Michigan. So the book tour is in the books at this point. But for the paperback, maybe in a year or so, I'll probably be out doing more public appearances.
And how can people find out more about you, Chad? Do you have a website?
Well, they can go to my website, chaddundas.com. They can look me up. They can look the book up on Amazon or iTunes or go to Barnes & Noble or go to Fact and Fiction.
Reviews.
I can't wait to read it. And he's also a writer, a beat writer for the MMA, for Bleacher Report.
Yeah. See his column twice a week or so.
Twice a week.
Yeah.
Okay, what a great guest you are, Chad. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. Anytime.
Yeah, you're listening to What Do You Know on KGVO, presented by Dawn Maddox and Glacier Sotheby's International Realty. And you can see them online at www.glaciersir.com. Arnie? It was a great show this week.
It was great for you having Chad.
You made my week.
I made your whole life.
You made my whole life today talking about wrestling, Lou Reed, boxing, and MMA.
It must be your birthday.
It must have been my birthday. Exactly. Anyway, folks, we'll see you next week on What Do You Know? Thank you for listening to What Do You Know?
I can't wait for the next show, Scott.
I'm excited too, Arnie. If you'd like to suggest a guest, send me an email at scottrichmond@townsquaremedia.com. We'll see you next week. And thanks for listening to Newstalk KGVO, AM 1290, 1015 FM, and newstalkkgvo.com.